Hello everyone, today we are looking at the Body Positive University on Virgie's website. This is that newsletter that I've been meaning to get to. A couple of things to note as we've seen this kind of blurb up here. All of the posts that are marked 101 are free to read, but then all of the 201 posts, which account for roughly like 2/3 of the content, maybe a little less than 2/3, is behind a paywall. You have to be a premium subscriber for it. And it's $10 a month or $100 for the year, neither of which I really want to pay Virgie for content that I don't even like. So we're just looking at a selection of what I thought were the best 101 posts, and then I think we're gonna wrap up Virgie's website and call it good. I have some other ideas that I'd like to move forward with now, and I'll talk about that more later. But for now, we're going to get into a couple of different posts. This was what was called the Fat Phobia series, week 1 myth busting. There's a couple of them. I have all of them lined up for us to look at. It says, welcome to week 1 of a 4-week Body Positive University special series on fat phobia. Here's an overview of what you can expect today. We're looking at myth busting, next is understanding impacts, fat activism, and then fat positive futures. An interesting note about this one that I'll get to a little bit more when we get there. This one was not marked as like part 4. So I spent a good 20 minutes looking for this magical 4th part of the series because I didn't see this little poster thing she had here. And it's just, I'll point it out a little bit more when we get to that post. But yeah, it was a little annoying. So it says, let's start with defining fat phobia. Fat phobia, also called anti-fatness or anti-fat bias, is a socially acceptable and widespread form of bigotry, stigma, or discrimination against large-bodied or fat people. Fat phobia is often masked through health rhetoric based on data that is misinterpreted or overgeneralized. We'll talk about that in this article. There is also considerable contention about whether or not fat phobia is a legitimate form of discrimination because currently body size is misunderstood as a mutable characteristic for fat people, and many Americans believe that only immutable characteristics deserve protection from abusive behavior or hurtful attitudes. So this is a little bit of a misinterpretation. So one, she says it's misunderstood as a mutable characteristic. It is a mutable characteristic. You can absolutely change your body weight. You can change your body weight. Number 2, Americans believe that only immutable characteristics deserve protection from abusive behavior or hurtful attitudes. Yes and no. So the issue here is that most decent people are going to say that you shouldn't shame someone for being fat. You shouldn't like harass them in public for it. You shouldn't, humiliate someone because they're fat. Most decent people would fall within that line. The issue is that you guys claim that completely innocuous behavior is fat phobic. Like the fact that I want to lose weight, I'm going for intentional weight loss only partially for health and also a good portion because I want to have a body that looks a certain way. You guys would call me fat phobic. The issue is that there's actually I'm trying to think of an allegory between other isms, and I can't think of a comparable comparison for like racism or homophobia or ableism or any of that, because I think because they're just not on the same level. They're not on the same level. And the issue is that even for mutable characteristics, most decent people don't think that you should be harassed for something that is ultimately not harming them. It's not even a matter that it's not harmless, because there's plenty of people that look at drug addicts and will just kind of move along. I tend to be one of those. I'm very much for safe injection sites, for as a dual purpose. One, it gives people a safe place to do their drugs and to have their drugs checked to make sure unnecessary deaths don't happen. But the other part is that I've worked in a couple of public spaces one of which was a public library. And if you don't give drug addicts a safe place to shoot up, they shoot up in public space bathrooms where kids go. There was a bathroom right next to the children's section at the public library that I worked at once. And little Johnny, little Mary is going to go into their bathroom, and there's a heroin addict shooting up in there, and there's needles there, and there's blood on the wall. Sometimes there's feces on the wall. No, I would much rather those people have a safe place to shoot up away from the general public where the discards of their activity can harm people. Let people that are trained professionals and being paid watch after these people rather than leaving it to public service workers who are barely paid over minimum wage, often forced to work part-time, and they don't get benefits, to deal with this. That is also, being a drug addict is also a mutable characteristic, and I don't necessarily think that someone should be attacked for being a drug addict. I don't think someone should have a knife taken to them because they're a drug addict. I don't think someone should be called names or experience abusive behavior because they're a drug addict, but that doesn't make their behavior any more okay. That doesn't make their lifestyle one that I approve of. I don't know how well that comparison went down. I hope it went okay. But my point is that there's plenty of mutable characteristics that people are attacked for, and I don't think that they should be. But that doesn't make where you are in that mutable characteristic, that doesn't mean you shouldn't work towards change. Does that make sense? I hope I'm making sense in this. Anyway, data aside, I'd like to ask you to consider this. Is it possible that the more humanitarian approach would be to decide that there's no bodily characteristic, mutable or immutable, that merits abusive behavior or hurtful attitudes? To a degree, I agree with this. Like, there's, again, like, if you want to go into bodily characteristics, how about the people that have COVID? I don't think that they should be attacked for having COVID. That being said, if you go out with COVID, let's say you're one of those people that doesn't have symptoms, you go out without a mask into public areas, I absolutely think you should be shamed. I absolutely think that you should, because it's your behavior that's the issue. It's your behavior. I don't have a problem with the fat people on TikTok, not most of them anyway. What I have a problem with is their unreasonable demands, they're trying to police other people's social media, and their misinformation. So it's less about their fatness and more about their behavior. Just as someone with COVID, it's them having COVID isn't a reason to attack them. They couldn't control whether they had COVID or not. They had less control over getting COVID as these people have being fat. But if they make decisions that could directly impact other people, that could directly harm other people, yes, you should absolutely attack them for that. Well, attack is a strong word, but you should absolutely call them out at the very least. Attack is a strong word. Attack, I think, goes into a more violent category than I really want, but I absolutely think that they should be called out, and to a degree, I think that they should be shamed. But let's return to the data monetarily to show you that it, too, supports the long-term immutability of weight. Let's return to the data monetarily. Is this about... I think she meant momentarily. Okay, anyway. Many studies and lots of anecdotal evidence show that weight loss, or more aptly, weight suppression, is possible in the short run. People look at this evidence and believe that because it is possible in the short run, it must be possible in the long run. This is what's called a false equivalency. Just because something is possible does not mean it can or should be maintained. Further, just because something is possible does not mean it is positive or health promoting. We've been taught culturally that being fat is always bad for your health and being thin is always good for your health. I disagree with this. There was, back in the, Virgie, you were alive in the 90s. Do you not remember the heavy criticism for the crazy amount of, low weight that was expected. At one point, there was this talk. I think Italy put out a requirement that models had to be within a healthy BMI range in order to work as a model, because there was this over promotion of being thin to the point of being underweight and unhealthy. No one thinks that being thin, well, that's, I'm not going to say no one, because there are some people that believe like the thinner the better, and that's only true to a degree. The vast majority of people, if they're looking at someone who is severely underweight, they're not going to think that's good. Most people won't anyway. And just as seeing someone who's maybe a little underweight, people aren't necessarily going to have a problem with that, just as someone who's a little overweight. If someone is like in the middle of the overweight category, most people aren't going to look at them and say, oh, they're too heavy, even though they probably should lose some weight to get down to a healthier BMI. Most people aren't going to harass them, or most people aren't going to judge that they need to lose weight, because we don't have that level of perception when it comes to weight. At least most of us don't, especially with this abundance of fat. I feel like our general measurement of like visually what looks like a healthy weight is skewed because obesity is so prevalent in the US. Just because being at a healthy weight is seen as good, and sometimes even to the point of being a little bit underweight, that doesn't mean that thin is always considered good. There's plenty of critics of Eugene Ikuni. There's plenty of critics of the pro-Anna community. This overgeneralization simply isn't true. Here's one small piece of evidence that counters this societal view. Focusing on BMI as a proxy for health may also contribute to and exacerbate weight stigmatization. Moreover, this focus ignores that many individuals whose BMI is considered normal yet are cardiometabolically unhealthy, 30% of this population. Overall, we found that using BMI as a main indicator of cardiometabolic health misclassifies an estimate of 74 million, probably closer to 75 million individuals. So one thing to note is this ellipses here, meaning that there was a portion of the quote that was cut out. There were actually portions of the quote were cut out in a couple of places. So it says focusing and So I get the feeling that these were cropped right before a but or a however that would have qualified these statements a little bit more. Furthermore, it's going into cardiometabolic health, which definitely is important. There are other forms of health, though, that could be affected by weight that would also be worth looking at. Looking at this one measurement and this one study, it looks at categories, and it was from 2005 to 2012, meaning that this is 10 years old. This was just posted last year, so she knows that she's using 10-year-old data. And if she isn't posting an additional study here coming up, and this is her one presentation of evidence to support her claim, this does not bode well for her. We've also been taught culturally that if you are fat, you should try to become thin because that is the best way to improve your health. This double-barreled assertion makes several presumptions, all of them false. 1. False. A fat person is just a thin person with excess fat. 2. False. Long-term weight suppression is possible for all or even most fat people. 3. False. Every thin person is healthier than every fat person. 4. False. Fat-phobic abuse and weight-based bullying don't play a role in a person's health. Here's the truth. 1. Fact. A fat person is not a thin person who happens to be the wrong size. A fat person is not a failed thin person. Fat people have always existed. This is such a weird way of classifying this. Absolutely. I mean, if you really want to break it down to a very basic understanding, yes, a fat person is basically a person who would be thin but has excess weight. Like, I don't really understand they're really trying to make it like being fat is the same as having a different skin color, and it's not. I'm struggling to fully like grasp, because it feels like I have to do a series of mental gymnastics in order to get here, but a fat person is not a thin person who happens to be the wrong size. They kind of are. A fat person is not a failed thin person. Fat people have always existed, but fat is not something you're born as. Like, fat people have always existed, but you can lose weight, meaning that you can be a thin person, meaning that a fat person is kind of like a thin person with excess weight. I don't really the first one just kind of baffles me. Two, fact, there is not a single study that has ever shown that long-term weight loss suppression is possible on a statistically significant scale, meaning those who experience long-term weight suppression are outliers, and even outliers may not have a better overall health outcomes. So here's my issue with that. You say ever, as in you've looked at every possible study available, which I don't think is possible, number one. Number two, I mean, I could look this up, but you've already given outdated information, number one. Number two, like, I don't really want to go spend time searching and reading through this right now. This might be something that we do later for the sake of this video because I want to get through some of the other stuff. We're not going to do that. But to say ever, and two, the thing is that you say there's not a single study that has ever shown that long-term weight suppression. Well, if you're looking for weight suppression, they're not going to use that. They're going to use weight loss. So this also kind of feels like it's a play on words a bit for Virgie, where she's saying it doesn't show weight suppression. Well, of course not, because they don't measure weight suppression. They measure weight loss. There's also, I just feel like she's playing with words a little bit here. It bugs me. Fact, when using BMI as a health indicator, almost 1 in 4 Americans erroneously believes they are healthy or unhealthy. What exactly are you claiming here? This needs to be expanded on because I don't understand what she's saying here. 4. Fact, the ongoing experience of being ostracized or bullied absolutely plays a role in a person's health. So long-term stress can absolutely play a role in a person's health, and I don't necessarily think that they should be regularly ostracized or bullied. But to say that I feel like she's presenting it as like the sole reason why that would affect their health and their weight has nothing to do with it, rather than looking at comorbid factors. Like, you're heavier, which would affect your weight, but then you've also experienced an extended period of stress due to ostracization or bullying that could also lead to health issues. Like, it could definitely be a combination of the two. I'm not saying that it's not, but let's not pretend that your weight doesn't play any role in it. Beyond these myths, there are even more issues with the idea that the best thing you can do as a fat person is attempt to become a thin one. But that will have to wait till next week. Come back to Fat Phobia Series Week 2, which we will, and she always ends it with class dismissed. Alright, Fat Phobia Series Week 2, Understanding Impact. We're just going to skip right down to the meat of the article. In today's article, we're going to get into the widespread impact of fat phobia. Fat phobia is a form of bigotry, as we've discussed last week. Like all forms of bigotry or oppression, it manifests in complex ways, some obvious and some less so. It's important to understand that fat phobia is not merely comprised of observable instances of fat shaming. Fat phobia weaves its way into how we see ourselves, how we interact with food, and who we see as desirable. Regardless of a person's body size, fat phobia impacts all of us in one way or another. For some, this impact can be devastating. For example, fat phobia manifests in people with anorexia nervosa who exhibit high levels of fear of being fat. There are a variety of issues that go into anorexia nervosa. There's competing factors in there, and to boil it down to fat phobia actually legitimately pisses me off. There's multiple competing factors about anorexia. Like, the desire to be thin is definitely part of it. That in itself is not fat phobic, so fuck off there. But there's also like a great degree of an attempt to control, and food is a way that they can control their life. So fat phobia also manifests in ways that some doctors are less likely to offer preventative care to their larger-bodied patients. These are vastly different manifestations of the same core issue, and yet both of them relate to the long-term physical and or mental health. So here's the thing. Yes, doctors will sometimes miss and just write off a patient because they're fat when they really need to look in and offer blood tests or whatever. It's not just being fat, though. There have been other issues. And sometimes you just have a shitty doctor. Sometimes it's the fact that you're a woman. Sometimes it's the fact that you may have a chronic illness and they think you're just a complainer. Sometimes it's because you're young. Sometimes it's because you're a woman or what have you. Like, there's a couple of different issues, and that's why it's your job as an adult to advocate for yourself or to go for a second opinion. Here's a useful visual that might help you understand fat phobia's impact a little more clearly. Fat phobia manifests in three dimensions: intrapersonal, interpersonal, and societal. Fat phobia is always operating on all three of these levels. Let's break them down. Intrapersonal. This level impacts self-perception and body image. Think of this level as the relationship an individual has with their bedroom mirror. Regardless of somebody's body size or shape, they can have very high levels of intrapersonal or internalized fat phobia, fear of gaining weight, fear they aren't the right size, and a sense of urgency that they have to control their shape or size. This isn't fat phobia. This is that fear of gaining weight, and I don't know about fear that they aren't the right size, but fear that they're too, I would say fear that they're too big, can be legitimate fears because it can affect their health. And the urgency to control their shape and size, depending on how big they are, that sense of urgency might be warranted. Interpersonal. This level impacts human-to-human interactions, how other people treat a person based on their size. Think of this level as the relationships and interactions an individual has with other individuals through things like dating, friendship, going to the grocery store, school, and professional networking. Because of fat phobia, 50% of all employers are less likely to hire a large-bodied candidate. In addition, we know many large-bodied children experience bullying that impacts their ability to focus in school. I agree with the kids that experience bullying due to their weight. We as teachers try to curb that as best we can. We can't control everything, though. There's just too many kids and not enough of us. That is an issue that's I'm going to stick to, and I know some people have been frustrated by this, but as someone who's worked with kids, it is something the kids have to learn how to tolerate differences in others, and I mean any differences. This is a skill that we have to teach kids, because kids are so used to what they've known for the first 5 years of their lives in their very insular family community, whatever that be. That might just be the core household, that might be the core household and some extended family, or even some extended family and some family friends. This self-contained community is mostly going to exhibit similar ideologies and similar perceptions, and sometimes, but not always, similar looks. Like, kids before kindergarten may have never experienced a disabled person. Depending on where they are, some of them have not experienced kids of other ethnicities. And when they see that for the first time, because it's not what they're used to, they either avoid it or attack it or whatever. And it's our job to teach kids that just because it doesn't fit in their realm of what they've experienced doesn't mean that they have a right to attack it, doesn't mean that it's wrong, and doesn't mean that it's something to be shamed or what have you. So there's and it largely depends on the kid, and it kind of depends on if parents introduce this tolerating differences and exposing them to different people early on. Some kids don't have that, and so we have to teach them. And this can, because it was such a core part of their early life, and they may still be getting that message from home, it can be an issue. But it ultimately comes down to what's not like them, not anything specifically. It can manifest as racism or homophobia or what have you later. In early experiences, it's almost always just this general, it's not like me mentality, therefore it needs to be criticized or avoided or what have you. But as for the 50% of all employers are less likely to hire larger bodied candidates, what job are these larger body candidates applying for? If it's a warehouse job, I don't blame them for not hiring them. You need someone that can be fast on your feet. You need someone that can bend and move and not need as many accommodations, because as it's unfortunate, but if here's the thing, a lot of companies wouldn't hire disabled people if they could get away with it because they don't want to offer accommodations. Fat people typically need more accommodations than the average person, and then they're not disabled on top of that, they're just fat. And so employers don't want to have to put up with that. And quite frankly, given that your accommodations may not be needed if you were just a bit thinner, maybe you should work on losing some of that weight so you don't need those accommodations. Level 3, societal or institutional. This level impacts the ease with which a person can or cannot navigate the structures, spaces, and institutions within the culture based on their size. This level is everything between and around levels 1 and 2, the physical spaces where human interactions happen, including work, leisure, family events, weddings, education, as well as the laws and norms that shape those interactions. This category includes things like seating in airplanes and restaurants, access to clothing that fits, and the availability of medical supplies like arm cuffs for blood pressure readings developed with a large body in mind. Weight discrimination is legal in 49 states, all but Michigan, and this is also part of level 3. Okay, let's take a look at this real quick though. Seating in airplanes, restaurants, and clothing that fits, and availability of medical supplies. These are all provided based on averages. That's just the way the system works. It goes on the average, not only weight, but the way that weight is just distributed within the body. So that's why even if you're like 5 women can be a size 12, but the same pair of pants won't fit all of them based on where their weight distributes. Because it's always the law of averages for any of this stuff. If you are so far out of the realm of average that you need all of this stuff, then perhaps the answer isn't to try and mold society to fit you, but to lose a little weight so you can fit a little bit better into society. I mean, I'm sorry, I know that sounds cold, but like to a degree, I think expecting the world to morph to fit you on when it's something that you can change with a bit of effort is just so unbelievably unreasonable. This three-dimensional model helps us understand some of the nuance of this issue. For instance, a person with a thin body may have exceedingly high levels of interpersonal fat phobia, perhaps to the point where they need to be hospitalized. What? This is an extremely stressful experience. However, they may not experience level 2 interpersonal fat phobia at all. Conversely, a person with a large body may have very low levels of intrapersonal fat phobia, yet may experience considerable fat phobia on levels 2 and 3. Experiencing interpersonal and or institutional fat phobia is also acutely stressful. Okay, it took me a moment, but I realized what they mean by intrapersonal fat phobia to the point of needing to be hospitalized. She's talking about those with anorexia nervosa. That's so fucked up to construe it that way. I mean, it's so fucked up, and it centers, once again, Virgie's centering herself on someone else's issues. And that's what the FAs do. They center someone else. I can be over here, and my life is chaotic, and so I go through some unhealthy methods in order to try to lose weight, but the bigger issue here is that I'm trying to control like the one thing that I feel I can control to an unhealthy degree, and they will center themselves in that struggle, my own personal struggle, my own personal hypothetical struggle. They will center themselves and say that I am harming them because of what I'm doing. It's just fucked up. This model can help us make responsible decisions as we think of ways to combat fat phobia, understanding that successful interventions must be addressed at all 3 levels. That's it for today. It's just Fat Phobia Series Week 3, Fat Activism. I'm just going to skip past those parts. Okay, this week we'll be looking at people who were interested in fighting fat phobia on level 3, the societal level, and learning an abridged version of the history of fat activism. Let's start with the year 1967. That year, the New York Times published a piece about a 500-person gathering in Central Park. It was called a Fat-In. Attendees held protest signs decrying weight-based discrimination and burned diet books. A lot of these people, though, weren't they like chubby chasers that just got tired of being picked on for their sexual preferences? Like, you guys like to center that this is, fat positivity and all that, when in reality it was a bunch of kinksters trying to normalize their fetish. The same year, an article titled "More People Should Be Fat" came out in the Saturday Evening Post, written by Lou Lauterbach. Lauterbach? I don't know if I pronounced that right. The piece detailed fat phobia at work and at the doctor. It has become so in to be thin that fat people's civil rights are repeatedly and openly violated. Fucking where? I love that she just quotes that, but like, where? A man named Bill Fabry read the piece and was inspired by it. Though Fabry wasn't fat himself, his wife Joyce was, and he witnessed her experience with weight discrimination. In 1969, he founded the National Association to Aid Fat Americans, NAFA, in Rochester, New York. Later, the name of the organization was changed to the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. As the name suggests, NAFA's goal was to foster acceptance for fat people. Some critics of acceptance movements argue that these movements maintain pre-existing power dynamic instead of interrupting them, with marginalized people seeking approval from the dominant group. A group of such critics began to form in California. They had originally been members of the local chapter of NAFA, but decided to branch off and start their own movement. They called their more radical offshoot the Fat Underground. In 1973, two of its members, Judy Free Spirit and Aldebaran, wrote and published the Fat Liberation Manifesto. Here's an excerpt from it. We believe that fat people are fully entitled to human respect and recognition. We are angry at the mistreatment by commercial and sexist interests. These have exploited our bodies as objects of ridicule, thereby creating an immensely profitable market selling the false promise of avoidance of or relief from that ridicule. We see our struggle as allied with the struggles of the other oppressed groups against classism, racism, sexism, ageism, financial exploitation, imperialism, and the like. And that is where the issue comes in. You see yourself as allied with those groups, and yet you seem to miss the clear differences. There's a clear difference between classism, racism, sexism, ageism, financial exploitation, and imperialism, and what you call fat phobia. There's a clear difference. You can't control which class you're born in. You can't control which race you're born as. You can't control what your sex is. You can't control how you get older. Financial exploitation is often the result of things that are outside of someone's control. Financial exploitation is the result of something outside of a person's control. It can be the product of abusive relationships, either be it romantic or through employers that try to say that we'll fire you if you don't work off the clock, and then that keep their employees a degree ignorant by saying that if they discuss their salaries, that they'll get in trouble, even though that itself is against the law. There's this issue with not educating people about legal matters that directly affect them in an everyday situation that companies recognize and exploit. These are issues that are beyond someone's control. It is not beyond your control if you are fat. Fat people of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose. The Fat Underground was influenced by second-wave feminism, including lesbian feminism and the Black Power movement. Their demand for liberation, not acceptance, seems inspired, in part, by the fact that Fat Underground members experienced multiple marginalizations and were therefore less interested in a single-issue politic. What do I mean? Well, if someone is both a queer person and a fat person, for example, agitating exclusively against weight discrimination will only help with one identity, but will not help to end societal homophobia. This is often how intersectional political movements begin. If you have time, watch this archival footage of the Fat Underground. Though the Fat Underground has dissolved, its aesthetics and values have lived on in current fat activist spaces. NAFA still exists and has put forth a number of important policy statements related to the ethical treatment of fat people, including a healthcare bill of rights, a policy on adoption and child custody discrimination, as well as one on weight loss surgery. Historic and contemporary fat activism could fill an entire volume. In fact, there's a book called Fat Activism, A Radical Social Movement by Charlotte Cooper, if you want to learn more. In short, fat activism fights for civil and human rights of fat people. Weight discrimination is still legal in 49 states, and the literature describing weight discrimination from the 60s could have been written in 2021. There is still a long way to go, but the people and organizations like NAFA and the Fat Underground have created useful frameworks and demands that will continue to shape fat futures. More on fat futures next week. So I took a quick look at that video. It might be worth looking into. I haven't actually watched a whole lot of it yet, but I realized that it was a half an hour long, and this video is already getting kind of long, so we might cover that in another video. Let's move on to the last of the 4-week one, and interestingly enough, it's listed down here, but it's not listed. It wasn't listed anywhere in the little archive thing. I skipped over this one initially, thinking that she had just forgotten about the 4th week because she didn't label this as such. But this is the last one for their special series. This week we'll be imagining fat positive futures. Fat positivity is the belief that fat bodies are not only worthy of basic human rights or acceptance, but that fat bodies are amazing, beautiful, and wonderful, and the unique part of body diversity. Before we continue, I want you to take a minute or two to imagine something for me. Imagine yourself in the future. Start with 1 year from now, then 5 years from now, then 10 years from now, then 20 years from now. What did your body look like as you imagined the future you? Most people I've met imagine that in the future they will have a different body size or shape. Most imagine they will be thinner than they are today. Why? We are all exposed to beauty ideals that valorize slender bodies. We internalize these views, that is, they become part of our own values and belief systems. This internalization affects how we see ourselves and our future. We may not want to imagine that we will largely be the same size or shape in the future, even though that is the likeliest scenario, because changing our bodies is such a central value in our culture. We see staying the same as a negative. To be honest, I think in general staying the same is a negative. And that's not just in your body, but in your personality too. If you become so stagnant that in 5, 10, 20 years you're the same person, then I think that you're failing at life a little bit. If you haven't grown in some way or another, and these can be a series of small changes. Maybe you used to eat white bread and now you eat whole wheat. Maybe you have worked on your negative self-talk. Maybe you have explored a variety of interests, and while not all of them worked out, you still gave them a shot. But if you have done nothing but the same things that you have always done for 5, 10, 20 years, then I think that for me, that sounds like a very sad existence. In fact, staying the same shape or size as we age can be a neutral fact, maybe even a positive one. Now I want you to try the exercise again, but this time as you time travel in your imagination, I want you to do so with the body and size you have right now. Imagine yourself 1 year from now with the same body size you have right now. Imagine yourself 5 years from now with the same body size you have right now. Imagine yourself 10 years from now with the same body size you have right now. Imagine yourself 20 years from now with the same body size you have right now. How was that? Difficult? Easy? Painful? Exciting? For a long time, I used to only imagine my future self as a thin self. It was unimaginable, painful even, to imagine that I would stay a fat person. I had internalized all the messages I'd received over my life, including the one that said that fat people were ill or unnatural and therefore shouldn't exist now, let alone in the future. The inability to see myself as I actually existed was also painful, but I couldn't quite register it as such at the time. I just thought I was committed to becoming the best version of myself. I would later find out that for me, being fat is part of being the best and most natural version of myself. Imagining my body and other fat bodies in the future is actually sort of a radical act. Them and thinking everything that they do, just how they think, is a radical act. I mean, there's a certain part of the fat acceptance movement, like, it's not all of it, but a good portion of it reads like that Kony 2012 bullshit. Does anyone remember that? Where people just kept put up these things on their social media of Kony 2012. They didn't do shit, but they thought that they were doing this big radical thing. And then later it was shown that the footage that had already started all of that was way old and like the situation had mostly rectified, but some people believe that they actually had a part in that, even though they had been like putting up these social media protests after the situation had already been resolved. Does anyone remember that? Because this whole thing about them thinking and how they think is a radical act just kind of reminds me of that. It's the start of creating fat positive futures. Our culture hasn't historically done the best job of creating visions of an inclusive future. Perfect example, The Jetsons. In 2017, The Verge published a piece on the 1960s cartoon The Jetsons, describing it as a bone-chilling dystopia. The Jetsons was a cartoon about the future, and there was a marked absence of all kinds of people: brown and black people, disabled people, queer people, and fat people. I grew up watching the cartoon and didn't realize until I was an adult that it was showing me a joyful, perfect, family-focused future where people like me don't exist. I think that's reading entirely too much into the fucking cartoon. Honestly, it was from the 1960s. It was such a radically different time that I think, like, saying that it's erasing brown people, black people, disabled people, queer people, and fat people, I think that's reading entirely too much into the cartoon of the time. I think that it just wasn't considered at the time because there was no notion of inclusivity at the time. And I'm not saying that it's right. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that it's right, but I don't necessarily think there was an intention behind it. A fat positive future is one that disrupts current cultural paradigms and problematic visions of where we're headed as a species. Regardless of your size, you can be part of imagining a future where people of all body sizes are accepted and treated with kindness, respect, love, and dignity. Class dismissed. So that's those four. This has gone on longer than I had anticipated. So I'm going to leave this here, and we'll cover the rest of the articles that I had picked out next week. The following week, we might cover that Fat Underground video. And then after that, so here's the thing. After my copyright content video with Fat Sapphic Bro, it was wildly successful, and I was, well, for me, I'm sure for a lot of people it wasn't like that successful, but for me it was easily my most successful video. It was the one that I got the most engagement in and the most feedback in, and I really want to be clear, I really appreciate it. But I found myself trying to figure out, okay, how do I replicate that success? I got very into my analytics for a little while, and I find myself getting more and more into my analytics, and I find myself not sticking to what I originally started making these videos for, which was to provide myself motivation for weight loss. So this isn't a YouTube thing. This isn't a social media culture thing. This is very much a me thing. This has happened before with me, and it happened with my gaming channel, where I became so focused on trying to put out content, and why am I not appealing to people, and why was this video less successful than this video, and trying to like manipulate things to the point where it's not to the point where it's like a second job yet, but I don't want it to get there, and I don't really like letting things go on for an extended period of time with no goal. So I have decided that at the end of this year, I will stop uploading content to this channel. It has been very fun while I've done it, but I don't want this to consume my free time so much. I don't want to be consumed with this chasing views and chasing social media and it becoming the only thing that I think about, and I feel like it's going there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish this Virgie stuff over the month of August, and then I have somewhere between 60 and 100 different TikTok accounts that I'd like to go over in my last hurrah, which I'm calling the Great Criticism. And we'll be looking at the past year for each of those accounts. We'll get through as many as we can, especially the more interesting ones. And I think for the month of December, I might do something special since it will be my last month uploading to this channel. But I'm very much the type of person that I need to put an end date on things, or I will just continue them in perpetuity to the point where I frustrate myself. And the issue is that I don't realize that when something's no longer fun for me. It's still fun for me now. I've been able to do that check-in, but I can go on something for a couple of years and not realize that it lost its joy a while ago. And I don't want to consume my free time chasing views or chasing whatever it is that I'm wanting from this channel. That wasn't what my initial focus was. So that, plus I've had other ideas for completely different content that I've wanted to pursue, but I've been focusing on this channel, and I'm not ready to let it go yet. But I'm gonna put an end date for myself on the 31st. I'm not deleting this channel. This isn't some Unis Honest thing where I'm just made all these videos and then I'm deleting the channel. I'm gonna leave the channel up because I don't see a problem with it. And should something come up, especially with one of my other social medias, I might do a one-off video here or there on this channel. December 31st marks my last day trying to upload consistently to this channel and making this a regular thing. So if you've watched to the end of this video, now you know what's going on going forward. I want to be clear, I appreciate everyone who has interacted with this channel, who has interacted with me, who has given me advice, who has kind of held me accountable when I've said some things that were kind of off the mark, who clarified things for me. Everything. I appreciate everything that I've gotten from this channel. I feel like this channel has improved me as a person, and I will forever be grateful for all of you that have watched and commented and given me feedback and talked with me. But I don't like letting things drag out, and I know I will if I don't set an end date for myself. In the last month, I'll probably link a couple of my new ventures of what I'm doing and where I want to go now. Keep in mind, they'll probably be radically different. But I will probably continue a weekly fitness log on my Instagram, which I will link closer to the end date of this channel. So if you watch to the end of this, now you know. And this isn't goodbye yet. It's just, I don't like blindsiding people. And so I want to let you guys know where I'm heading with this channel. So, with that note, that's it for today. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.